Welcome to the Impact Nations podcast, episode 539, Irreducible Difference. This week, we're looking at the call of God in our lives and how it's yet another example of His incredible compassion. We're also going to investigate some possible signs that we've become slaves to how others think of us. And finally, I think you too may be shocked and amazed with Matthew's use of language as he makes a really difficult comparison for us to face. So here we go with Matthew chapter 20.
Hi, good to be back together again as we carry on in our study on Matthew's Gospel. Just like last week in chapter 19, Matthew continues to write about Jesus' teaching about the way of the kingdom and how it is radically opposed to the world system. You know, when we face his teaching honestly, it's very unsettling, and so often it demands a change. This is what the Bible calls metanoia. We use repentance to translate metanoia, but it's not about feeling bad. It's a change of direction, a change of way of thinking. And that's very much at the heart of these two chapters. Now, the parable that we're going to look at in the first half today gives us a great opportunity to grow in how we read the Scripture, how we read it true both to its literal meaning and its deeper spiritual meaning. And that, of course, has been like a sub-theme throughout this series. As I studied this parable today, that I'm going to present today, I've been studying it for a while, I've really been confronted with something, and I'm just going to confess this. It's so easy to have in our mind a certain way of thinking and then find a passage that fits that. And for me, some of you maybe even have heard me teach about the parable of the landowner, the 11th hour workers. And I've said repeatedly for, 15, 20 years that the reason the 11th hour worker was paid the same as the one who worked all day is that because in the 11th hour, the time that we're in, there's such an increase of anointing that what used to take all day only takes an hour. But if I'm looking honestly at this, the passage doesn't really say that. It doesn't prohibit that, but that's really not what this passage is about. So remember, we've talked about the literal reading, the moral reading, and the spiritual reading. We're gonna use this parable as an opportunity to go deeper in our understanding of those three readings. Now, Matthew is the only gospel writer who includes this parable. And let me give you just a little bit of cultural background. Most people, working people in first century Palestine were laborers, and it was an extremely hard life. And to be paid a denarius was just enough to sustain life. It was just enough to be able to buy food to feed your family tomorrow. That's why I've told you before in the Lord's Prayer, give us today tomorrow's bread. So the life of a day laborer was very insecure, like today in much of the world. It seems ironic to us, but you know that life as a servant or slave was more secure than that of a day laborer. They got such low pay, they didn't know if they were going to be hired each day. To get that denarius, they had to work 12 hours in a hot Mediterranean climate. It's the same for so many places in the world where day laborers are paid very, very poorly, and they work under terrible, terrible conditions. This has challenged me for more than a decade now in terms of my own personal choices as a consumer. And so I try to incorporate that into my purchasing choices, knowing where the country is from, knowing what the labor conditions are like. So with that little bit of background, let's look at the parable of the workers in the vineyard. For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. Now when he had agreed with the laborers for a denarius a day, he sent them into the vineyard. And he went out about the third hour. By the way, that would be about 9 o'clock in the morning. He went out about the third hour and saw others standing in the idle in the marketplace. And he said to them, "You also go into the vineyard, and whatever is right I will give you." So they went. Again he went out about the 6th and the 9th hour and did likewise. And about the 11th hour, that'd be 5 in the afternoon, he went out and found others standing idle and said to them, "Why have you been standing here idle all day?" And they said to him, "Because no one hired us." And he said to them, "You also go into the vineyard, and whatever is right you will receive." Now when evening had come, the owner of the vineyard said to his steward, "Call the laborers and give them their wages, beginning with the last to the first." And when those who came who were hired about the 11th hour, they each received a denarius. But when the first came, they supposed they would receive more, and they likewise received each a denarius. And when they had received it, they complained against the landowner, saying, "These last men have worked only 1 hour, and you've made them equal to us, who have borne the burden and the heat of the day." But he answered one of them and said, "Friend, I am doing you no wrong. Do you not agree with me for a denarius? Take what is yours and go your way. I wish to give to this last man the same as to you. Is it not lawful for me to do what I wish with my own things? Or is your eye evil because I'm good? So the last will be first, and the first will be last. For many are called, but few chosen." Before we go deeper, I want to make a few initial points. First of all, notice the owner went out. God is always the initiator. He is the seeking king. He is the inviting king. If we're going to follow Jesus, we need to have a life that seeks and invites. But I also want you to remember this is a parable. It uses realistic but often exaggerated features. This is what Jesus did in his parables. The purpose was to make a significant central point, to teach something, not that every detail be taken literally. Now, the features of Jesus' parables are taken from everyday life. Just think, for example, the parable of the sower, or someone who's looking for a lost coin. But often they do not accurately portray everyday activity or occurrence. Because, for example, what owner would go out 5 times in a day to hire workers? How could he still do his job or oversee the work? Going out 5 times is simply a literary device that Jesus used. And this highlights the urgency of God's purpose. Remember when we looked at chapter 10, we saw that Jesus said, "Pray to the Lord of the harvest that he will send out workers." The Lord urgently wants harvest workers. So this is one initial point we can glean from this story. Secondly, they were idle in the marketplace. We see that in verse 3, again in verse 6. Why are you standing idle? Because no one's hired us. To be standing idle in the marketplace is to be caught with no purpose. And this leads to this sense of being invisible or even without value. But when God calls us, he calls us to the greatest purpose there is, the harvest field. And his call is his compassion, because he knows that to be without purpose, we quickly lose meaning. Or we maybe never even discover meaning in our life. Just think about what unemployment does to people. Many of us, maybe most of us, have had a time of unemployment. And even beyond the fear and the financial worry, it comes always with this sense of no value, of being passed over, of being somehow invisible. Remember in Matthew 9:35, Jesus hired them in the marketplace because what? his great compassion. He saw them as harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd, and he was moved with compassion. This is why I believe the gospel is about heaven now. It's beyond a future perspective. The gospel rescues right now. You know, just an hour ago, we were looking at a video that came in from a refugee camp in Uganda where we're working. It's called Chaka 2. And there's about 135,000 refugees there, and we've done feeding programs with them, emergency relief programs. But this video came in. We have now started a gardening, a really high nutrition gardening system. In fact, less than a quarter acre fed 40 families. Well, not only do they get food, but they have been stuck in this refugee camp, some of them for years, with nothing to do, and now suddenly they have purpose. And so as they have got their first harvest, they said, we want to do more. And so they're on their way to doing 2 acres, which is actually a lot of land to do this intensive. The point is, not only did it bring them food, but it brought purpose and focus. The third thing is that the laborers were hired to work for God's purpose. The invitation is about a purpose bigger than our own. This gospel is bigger than us. You know, in this sense, being hired by the gospel frees us from ourselves because we start to have a bigger purpose than we are. And then when it's evening, he brings in the workers. The day laborers in Jewish culture, by Jewish law, they were always to be paid at the end of each day. There was no, well, we'll pay you at the end of the month. Every day. Leviticus 19:13, you shall not keep for yourselves the wages of a laborer until morning. And then we see an interesting thing that the workers complained. And Jesus puts this into the story. But he answered one of them and said, friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for a denarius? The word friend for Matthew is ironic. He only uses it when the person is clearly in the wrong. Let me give you 2 examples. Matthew 22:12, the parable of the feast. And someone comes in and he's not wearing a wedding garment. Friend, how did you get in here without a wedding robe? And he was speechless. Or in Matthew 26:50, Jesus said to him, Judas, friend, do what you are here to do. Sometimes this parable is seen as Jesus' defense against him accepting obvious sinners. Remember, the religious folks were always angry or mocking him for accepting sinners. And in this case, some see this as they're sinners based on their idleness. But frankly, although you'll see this in different commentaries, I think it only works if Jesus' opponents are who he is addressing this parable to. But it seems clearly that it's to the disciples he's talking. So now let's start to go a little deeper. Let's look at the spiritual, or what we've called water to wine reading. The first 5 trips to the marketplace represented 5 stages in history of the world. Now I'm going to give you different water to wine readings throughout church history. So the first one represents 5 stages in the history of the world. Adam to Noah, Noah to Abraham, Abraham to Moses, Moses to Christ, and Christ to the apostles. Several of the church fathers interpret the 5 trips this way. Gregory saw in this going again and again to the marketplace the persistence of the Lord. He wrote, at no time then did the Lord cease sending his people, workmen, to instruct them, to cultivate his vineyard, as it were. So he sees this as the faithfulness of God. Another reading, spiritual reading, is that the 5 stages of life which people these are the 5 stages of life which people experience. at the point when they experience conversion. I said that rather awkwardly. They either get converted at childhood, adolescence, in the prime of life, old age, or at the point of death. Now, in either of these interpretations, the denarius represents eternal life. Chrysostom said this: the vineyard is God's commandments and laws. The period of working is one's lifespan. The laborers are those who at different times are called to do what God commands. The early morning and the 3rd, 9th, 11th hours are those who at differing times in their lives have come and become justified. Another reading is that the Jews are represented in the first hirings, the Gentiles in the 11th hour. Gregory the Great, who lived in the 6th century, said that when the landowner asked, "Why are you standing here idle?" and they answer, "Because no one has hired us," means that no patriarch and no prophet had come to them. When they said, "No one has hired us," it was the same thing as saying, "No one has preached to us the ways of life." So what he is saying is that this parable is that now suddenly the way of life that the Jews had rejected, but the Gentiles heard it and they received it. This was a very common interpretation among the church fathers. Fourthly, it's often interpreted, see how many interpretations there are. It's often interpreted as a parable about God's grace. And this is very popular. But strictly speaking, this doesn't seem to be the main theme, because the parable is about the goodness of God. It's not contrasting works and grace, especially the Reformed tradition is taught, because no one gets free wages. That would be grace. All receive what was agreed upon before beginning to work. So, strictly speaking, it's not even about generosity, because a denarius was subsistence pay. So, that's not the point of the story. Now, at the same time, the story is not suggesting that God is stingy. You see, it's so important as we look at parables not to try to make them say what we want them to say. Another reading of this parable is that God's goodness is connected to both his patience and his perfect knowledge of our hearts. That he never violates our free will, but moves in response to it. That the 11th hour workers only came because that's when they were ready to come. Again, Chrysostom wrote this: "Why did the landowner not hire all of them from the outset? The difference was the readiness of those who were called." Paul clearly says this too. "When God, who separated me from my mother's womb, was pleased." That's Galatians 1:15. And when did it please him? When Paul was ready to respond. God called Paul at that time when he was ready. Interesting, God called the thief on the cross at the very end of his life in a similar way. What can we learn from this? We need to resist the temptation to live with regret, or maybe even complain that we didn't hear the gospel sooner or we didn't turn to Christ sooner. I love the verse in Galatians 4:4, "But when the time was right, God sent his Son." So these are some of an overview of some of the spiritual interpretations. Let's look a little bit at a literal reading. Number one, the parable is directed against envy or greed among Jesus' disciples. And to me, this seems highly likely for a number of reasons. First of all, the parable was addressed to the disciples, not the Pharisees. And we saw before this in Matthew's gospel that the disciples frequently talked about who was the greatest. Remember in chapter 18. And then interestingly, Matthew places this second such discussion almost immediately after this parable. We're going to see that in a few minutes. So this parable is intended to tell the disciples that life in the kingdom is such that there's no room for superiority over others or arrogance. With spiritual pride, we so easily slip into an attitude that, well, those sinners are going to get theirs. This is so true. This is just I found this hurtful in the great rise of the rapture literature, that there's almost gleeful over the judgment that is coming to sinners. Jesus said, "Blessed are those who mourn." So I think the main point of the parable then is that he uses it to teach us that God's treatment of people, God's judgment, is not based on human standards of justice. It focuses instead on the goodness of the owner. And the second focus is the complaint of those who thought they deserved more for their work. That, I think, is the central point. This complaining, this envy, it goes all the way back to Genesis 3. When we stop putting our trust in God's goodness, remember Genesis 3 is the fall, and they stopped trusting God and they ate from the tree. And what happened was they moved from trust to insecurity, to fear. Oh, we're naked. Oh, we've got to take care of ourselves. It goes all the way back to that. I think we need to understand that Jesus is addressing that in this parable, that we're not to worry about getting what we need or what we think we deserve. Because, this always leads, this insecurity takes us to either compare what others have with us, and then what that takes us to is either we feel envy because we think we don't have as much, or pride because we have more. We're always trying to assess fairness and our level of accomplishment, and that's exactly what the disciples were doing. Remember, last week we said that Peter expressed insecurity when he asked Jesus after the rich young man was turned away, well, what do we get for following? This is the universal human trait, to see justice as that which gives no one else an advantage. We see this as unfair, that every parent knows. Every child at different points says, that's not fair. I think that this comes into our corporate church life. That it even includes, I'm sorry to say, I'm sad to say, that this even includes the way we see as believers the poor and the alien. In this way, it's like we see God's justice because they didn't work hard, or they're not going to work, or the aliens are trying to take our jobs, or whatever it may be. It's because we see justice as a weapon to limit God's generosity. That's what this parable talks about. And this is absolutely diametrically opposed and opposite to the radical, inclusive, and relentless rescuing love and whole movement of God. I'll say it again. If we will let Christ's words go deep, they will challenge us, and if we allow them, they will change us. So after he kind of rebukes the other jealous workers, he says in verse 15, or is your eye evil because I'm good? So Jesus clearly equates envy with evil. Is your eye evil? Describes, of course, jealousy, a lack of generosity. But look at this in contrast. Proverbs 22:9, describing God's heart. He who has a generous eye will be blessed, for he gives of his bread to the poor. That's both God and that's those who follow God. Instead of an evil eye, he who has a generous eye will be blessed, for he gives his bread to the poor. Now let's look at the moral reading, because it reveals the goodness and mercy of God, because the owner gives the workers who are hired later in the day what they need to live on. That in and of itself is a message. He gives them what they need. He doesn't say, well, you didn't work long enough or you stood around idle. He gives them what they need. The employer in this story really cares about the poor and the needy, the unfortunate. Think of it. Think of this story. Think of you being one of those day laborers who hasn't been hired, and as the hours go by, just begin to sense their growing hunger, their worry for their family, their sense of hopelessness. I'm not going to get anything today. The landowner truly cares about those feelings. So in light of Proverbs 22, God is good because he gives to the poor. The rich young man we saw last week was not good, even though he thought he was, because he did not give of his wealth to the poor. This parable challenges me to imitate the goodness and the generosity of God. If he is good and gives to the poor without any judgment, then all of Jesus' followers should do the same, starting with me. And so the parable finishes, so the last will be first and the first will be last, which is the bracket. Just at the end of chapter 19, just before this parable, we have the very same phrase. So there's also an eschatological point to this story. In other words, as it relates to the end times, the second coming of Christ. Just as God's generosity is a challenge and a surprise to the other workers, I believe we will be surprised at the end of history's story. So this verse and the one in chapter 19 tells us that God's rescue, God's salvation will not unfold according to human calculation or expectation. No one will get less than promised, but some will get much more than they expected. Let's move on. Verses 17 to 19. While Jesus was going up to Jerusalem, he took the 12 disciples aside by themselves and said to them on the way, "See, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be handed over to the chief priests and scribes, and they will condemn him to death. Then they will hand him over to the Gentiles to be mocked and flogged and crucified, and on the third day he will be raised." Matthew is a master of narrative. He continues to both build tension and to keep us focused on the context for all that is happening in this chapter. They are on that journey that began in chapter 17. They are on this journey to Jerusalem. You know, these verses are like a table of content for what is going to follow. Look closely at them. He tells them about their entrance into Jerusalem. We call it the triumphant entry, chapter 21. About his arrest, chapter 26. About his condemnation by the Jewish leaders and the Roman authorities, chapter 26 and 27. That he will be mocked and flogged and crucified, chapter 27, and he will be resurrected. So now we move forward. Starting at verse 20, Jesus talks about greatness is found in serving. Then the mother of the sons of Zebedee came to him with her sons, and kneeling before him, she asked a favor of him. And he said to her, "What do you want?" And she said, "Declare that these 2 sons of mine will sit, one on your right hand and one on your left in your kingdom." But Jesus answered, "You do not know what you're asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I'm about to drink?" And they said, "We're able." And he said to them, "You will indeed drink my cup, but to sit at my right hand and my left, this is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared by my Father." When the other 10 heard it, they were angry with the 2 brothers. But Jesus called them to him and said, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. It will not be so among you. But whoever wishes to be great among you must be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you must be your slave, just as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." This episode reveals, perhaps more starkly than any other, 2 things. One, the foundational, irreducible difference of values between the world and the kingdom. Secondly, it also shows us how deeply ingrained that world system is in each of us. Now, 3 times Jesus takes his disciples to the place of realizing that his destiny, one that he fully embraces, is suffering, of emptying himself. This is the ultimate example of taking the low road. Matthew 16:21, from that time on, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and undergo great suffering at the hands of the elders, chief priests, and scribes, and be killed on the 3rd day, and then be raised. Chapter 17, as they were gathering in Galilee, Jesus said to them, "The Son of Man is going to be betrayed into human hands, and they will kill him, and on the 3rd day he will be raised." And they were greatly distressed. And now, as we've just read, he says it again. This repetition was not necessary because the disciples were stupid, were thick-headed. It's because of the incredible pull to be successful, the pull to be of higher rank than another. It is so powerful. It is so ingrained into our flesh. Jesus had to tell them again and again, the way of the kingdom is the way of the cross. By the way, this is why we must continually preach the cross. I encourage you to pray contemplatively, pray about the cross of Christ. To read the Gospels with brutal honesty is to be reminded of this continual battle within ourselves. We hold on to the desire to be successful, to be well thought of. The human concern with status and importance is one of the most fundamental instincts. With great pain, it must be unlearned by those who will follow Jesus, whose lives belong to his kingdom. Beloved, I am convinced this is the heart of what Jesus meant by telling his disciples that again and again, you must lose your lives to find them. So let's look at the context. He had just told them once again that he was going to Jerusalem to suffer and die. He just shared that with them. Now imagine the pain for Jesus of this moment when they start jockeying for position. This episode reveals just how much metanoia, how much repentance, changing of their minds, was going to have to happen. They were all ambitious. They were all prone to the very envy that Jesus had just taught them through the parable. So let's look at some points here, kind of verse by verse. Verse 21. The sons of Zebedee's mother says, "Declare that these 2 sons of mine will sit, one at your right hand and one at your left in your kingdom." One at your right hand and one at your left. Interesting. Notice this. Matthew uses this same phrase in another place in his gospel. Chapter 27. Then 2 bandits were crucified with him, one on his right and one on his left. Isn't that interesting? Nothing's by accident in this gospel, folks. By repeating this phrase, Matthew is pointing us to the great honor of being beside Jesus, being with Jesus at the cross. It is the honor of suffering with him. The way of the kingdom is not going to be found in seeking to join Jesus in his glory, but to join him in his suffering. Verse 22, you don't know what you're asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I'm about to drink? For Jesus, kingship is tied to suffering. And every Jew would have understood this, because in the Old Testament, the cup represented suffering most of the time. Folks, in our contemporary Western church, we are having great difficulty with this. We much prefer a triumphant Jesus, what Richard Rohr calls touchdown Jesus, to a suffering servant. This is a huge issue in the church in our day. But it is through the cross that Jesus will defeat death and darkness. So he says, are you able to drink the cup? And they say, oh, we are able. As one of the church fathers pointed out, they say this not so much by the boldness of their own hearts as by the ignorance of the trial. We often underestimate the pain of a trial until we're in the midst of it. Verse 23, to sit on my right hand and my left is not mine to grant, but it's for those for whom it has been prepared by my Father. Do you see here again, Jesus always trusted the Father's actions. He did not need to know everything. This is part of him being fully God, but also fully man. So that verse speaks to me of trust. Now, when the other 10 heard it, they were angry with the two brothers, I can imagine. Their anger takes us to the climax of this story. Chapter 18 led to it. The parable of the landowner that we just looked at led to it. But what Jesus says is not just for James and John. He addresses his words to all of them, and with great emphasis. Jesus called them to him and said, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. It will not be so among you. Very emphatic words. But whoever wishes to be great among you must be your servant. Whoever wishes to be first must be your slave. This, folks, is the key message of this passage. Jesus has seen this among them for a long time, this competitiveness, this what's my place. And he addressed it in chapter 18. And he addressed it by implication in chapter 19 when he brought the children to him and he said, for such is the kingdom of heaven. But now he spells it out in the most emphatic way possible. And he points directly at them. There's no escaping his words, either for them or for us. It shall not be so with you. This is the clearest possible delineation between the world and the kingdom. Like the landowner parable, there is no ranking in the kingdom, and there is no room in the kingdom to lord it over anyone. Jesus' words call us to look at not only our own lives, but to look honestly at our corporate life together. To look honestly at our churches, our Christian organizations. See, these words take us back once again to the Beatitudes, to the poor in spirit, the meek, those who mourn over their own sin and over the pain that it causes in the world, those who are truly merciful. This is at the heart of being born from above. It is so much bigger than, did I pray a sinner's prayer? I'm not against a sinner's prayer, but it's just such a shallow entry point. This is what it means to be born from above, this realigning of our lives. To not compete, to not be envious, but instead to celebrate others' successes, to celebrate and honor others' gifts. This is the corporate life in the kingdom. Now, Jesus calls us beyond an attitude to action. A number of weeks ago, I said that humility only happens by humbling ourselves. It's the only way to become humble is to humble ourselves. It literally means taking the lowest place. And so we choose to humble ourselves. The simplest things. Gathering in a home, we don't take the best spot. Maybe we're the first ones to sit on the floor. Maybe we're the first ones to help clean up. Or there's a million things, but the only way to learn humility is I have to choose to humble myself again and again. Now, in the very same way, to become a servant, we talk about having a servant's heart. And it's so easy to say. But the only way to get there is to actually serve another, and then another, and then another. See, we're following the servant king. I need to make this practical in my life all the time. When Jesus said, "Come follow me," I'm following a seeking and inviting and a serving king. I need to serve. I need to make this practical. The other night, I went out with some other people, just a member. I wasn't leading or anything. And we went to the homeless, living in tents and under tarps, and it was very cold, and we went and we served them. I'm not telling you to say there's anything glorious in that. I'm telling you, on the contrary, I needed it more than they did. I need to have a life of serving others. Chrysostom said this: "Loving the first place is not fitting for us, even though it may be so among the nations. Such a passion becomes a tyrant." I think there's great wisdom here. It is so easy for us looking for the first place, subtly, almost unconsciously. It's so easy for this to become a way of thinking and living. And when it happens, we become a slave to how others see us. Verse 28, "Just as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many." This is the first verse in Matthew's gospel that actually gives us the meaning of Jesus' death. The disciples were confronted with the great paradox that even for the Son of Man, the way to go up is to first go down. And let's look again at a few verses from Philippians 2, what's called the kenosis, the emptying. "But he emptied himself, taking the form of a slave. Being born in human likeness, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross." This is the laying down of Christ's divinity, not just to become human, which of course is a great mystery and wonder, but to, by his own free will, to actually lay his life down. At the beginning of Matthew's gospel, way back in chapter 1, the angel prophesies to Joseph, "And she will bear a son, and you will name him Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins." This was Jesus' mission. But in order to fulfill his mission, he must follow the path of the suffering servant. You know, the prophet Isaiah looked across hundreds of years and vividly described what Jesus' death would mean. I'm reading from Isaiah 53, some different verses between 7 and 12, and I'm reading from the Septuagint, which, by the way, is the version of the Old Testament that Jesus and Paul and the early church used. Starting at verse 7, "Although he was ill-treated, he opened not his mouth. He was led as a sheep to the slaughter, and as a lamb is silent before his shearers, so he opens not his mouth. For his life is taken from the earth, and because of the lawlessness of my people, he was led to death. He is the righteous one, who serves many well, and he shall bear their sins. He bore the sins of many, and was delivered over because of their sins. Chrysostom said this: it is as if he were saying, I willed not even to stop at death, but even in death gave my life as a ransom. For whom? For enemies. For you. If you are abused, my life is given for you. It is for you, me for you. Now, this chapter contains some of Jesus' most challenging teaching in all of Matthew's gospel, and it goes beyond action to the deepest motives of the heart, yet at the same time it calls for action, a change of how we do things, a change of how we relate to others. Deeper still, it confronts that most basic drive of my ego self to be recognized, to be treated fairly, to feel good about myself, to be admired by others. Once again, Jesus pushes me further inward to the place where I can, with great honesty, let him strip off the layers of my self-protection that go all the way back to the Garden of Eden. It is in these countless layers, as they are stripped away, where he reveals my truest self. He takes me beyond my failures to my belovedness. God bless you. We'll carry on in about a minute as Tim and I will do some follow-up discussion.
Now what? The gospel is meant to be lived. We now invite you to be a part of the discussion as we talk about how to apply this teaching. YouTube viewers can use the comment section below. You can also email your questions and comments to podcast@impactnations.com. Okay, well, that's a hard-hitting chapter. Leaves us with lots to think about, and I do want to just spend a few more minutes chewing on some of what it means for us in daily life. Before I do that, I wanted to give people a bit of an announcement that we're pretty excited about.
We're very excited.
We are very pleased to announce the coming of the Beautiful Gospel Conference. It is coming May 11th to 14th. It'll be right here in Albuquerque, New Mexico.
Yep.
And we are inviting every single one of you, our listeners, to come and be with us, hang out with us, and three of our great friends, who I think are becoming your friends too, you just haven't met them yet, which is Cherith Nordling, Bradley Jerzak, and Brian Zond, three of our repeat guests here on the podcast who I think our listeners would agree every time these guys are on, we're left going, whoa.
Yeah.
So imagine getting to spend 4 days with these guys, just hearing wisdom, but also having time to really just sit and ponder that, some of what we've learned and heard. What's some of your vision for this upcoming conference? What are you hoping people will come away with?
Oh, well, for one, I hope that there will be a renewed understanding of not only how powerful, but how really wonderfully beautiful this gospel is at a depth that we don't know. I hope they'll come away with a new, out of that understanding, a new capacity to share a beautiful gospel in a beautiful way. Yeah. We have one of our dear friends coming over from Australia, Craig Stevens, and he is a brilliant, in fact, I think he's the most gifted one-on-one evangelist I've ever met. And he will be doing a workshop. I hope that people come away having had a profound experience of the presence of God and being in a community, Wednesday to Saturday, in a community of people with the same kind of longing.
Yeah.
And so that's some of what I hope they come away with.
Yeah. And my hope, as always, is that a new revelation of the beauty, and in some ways the simplicity of the gospel, as good news, unconditional good news, will, as it sinks down deep inside of each of us, will actually then begin to overflow out of us as we leave that place and really begin to impact the people around us in terms of our community, our coworkers, our family members, our neighbors, so that we are, I'm going to say better equipped, and I'll qualify that in a second, but better equipped to share this unconditional good news. And when I say equipped, I want to be careful. This is not a conference of, try these 7 things on your coworkers and you'll get more people saved. That's not what we're talking about, but rather let the beauty of Christ, behold the beauty of Christ, and allow it to completely change the way you understand him, or the way you understand the good news, and that can't help but overflow from you.
Yeah. What is on the inside comes out.
Yeah. Exactly.
And I'm with you. We talked a lot about this. There's been an awful lot of prayer and thought and planning already gone into this. This is not any kind of a how-to conference, but I believe by going deep into the heart, it will bear fruit that remains.
Indeed. Now, you may be asking, how do I sign up? Let me come. I want to go. We're working on the registration page as we speak. Actually, Isaiah is elsewhere right now working on the registration page. We've got our team in Uganda who do all of our print media and videos and things like that. They're working on a full website for this thing that we're hoping to launch within a few days. So I presume if you are a podcast listener that you are part of our email list. If you're not, get on there. You can just email us, podcast@impactnations.com. Say, hey, send me your emails, and we will do so. Stay tuned. We will have announcements coming out very soon with a registration link, and if you register early, you will save a few bucks and reserve your space. We've got a great venue lined up.
Fantastic.
We've got a worship team coming together that I'm really excited about, and I think this is going to be a really, really rich time. So you don't want to miss it. I know partly this was born out of the fact that we're coming up on 2 years since we did a journey of compassion due to a little thing called the pandemic, and we've got people who are hungry just to be together. The Impact Nations family is longing to just be together, encourage one another, and enjoy the presence of the Lord together. So in one sense, this is a time to just connect again with people that you haven't seen in a while. So anyway, the Beautiful Gospel Conference, May 11th to 14th right here in
Block that out on your calendar.
Yeah, block it out right now. Don't do anything else. Netflix can wait. All right. I wanted to ask you a question. You said something, and I want you to clarify for me. You said we must continually preach the cross. And then even just as we were walking over here to sit down, you said something similar again in terms of the church isn't going to grow unless we get this. And so I want you to clarify. When you say we must continually preach the cross, what does that mean? What does that look like? What's a sermon or how do we preach the cross?
Okay. Well, first of all, what I actually said is the church, the way we're doing it, won't grow if we suddenly start preaching the suffering Jesus and the cross, because we're not ready for that.
Right.
But as we go deeper into him, things start to shift. Preaching the cross, Paul said to the Corinthians, I purpose to know nothing among you except Christ and him crucified. And I believe we need to spend a lot more time on the mystery of the cross, on what happened at the cross, what is continuing to happen because of the cross. Mm-hmm. I also believe that there's a place for contemplation of the cross, of just being still and either physically having a cross or even a crucifix in your study area, or just mentally thinking about it, not in a morose kind of way, but the wonder and the cost of our salvation. Also the great power of it. We'll get to talking more about the cross as we get near the end of this gospel of Matthew. But I think that we just need that. And I also would say, just in passing, that we tend to, many of us as Protestants, even Easter week, Passion Week, we pass over the cross to quickly get to the resurrection. The resurrection's wonderful, but it is wonderful because of the cross.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess that's what I mean.
All right. So pushing back, I'm sure that many preachers would say to you, "Well, we are preaching the cross. Like, what aren't they doing or what aren't we doing in the church at large that we need to start doing in terms of meditating on the cross, on the cost of
I think
crucified
I
Christ?
think on and I can't say what every church is doing, of course.
Sure, yeah.
But I know that, as you've heard me say before, we don't focus very much on behold the Lamb of God, that Paschal Lamb, the one who emptied himself to the point of death, as we referred to again today. That we tend to talk more about how we can live victoriously. Now, I'm not saying we should just live groveling. I think you know that.
Yeah.
But rather than confronting those places in our life that the cross we need to take to the cross.
Yeah. Which probably means we need to spend more time in our worship services, even in our worship songs, singing about the work of the cross. And I guess not just the victory that comes from that. I have to think more about. And
certainly, I'm not saying don't celebrate the victory.
Right.
But we need to hold the two. Isn't that always the paradox of the gospel?
Yeah.
Right. And as I taught months ago on the Beatitudes.
Yeah.
If you look at them, each one, it's like crucifixion and resurrection.
Yeah.
And we need to go through both places. I was thinking this morning, again, how it would be so good to maybe even contemporize some of the great hymns because they have such rich theology. Yeah. And I remember years ago, you were leading worship at one of the churches that I pastored, I guess the last church that I pastored, and I would say, hey, I'd love for us to sing this song, and you as a musician were able to take that and put it in a modern kind of arrangement that bluntly was more palatable to the younger people, but we were singing the richness of it.
Yeah. I think we're going to do some of that in May, by the way, and leave time for contemplation to really let this stuff sink in. That parallel you drew that Matthew wrote between his turn of phrase
on the right
and on the left, and that he reused that at the crucifixion.
Yeah,
that really blew me away. Actually, I have to confess, I stopped doing what I should be doing, which is making sure this is going all right and making sure that I'm getting questions written down. And instead, I had to immediately go and make a note in my Bible about that because it's so crucial. What an amazing juxtaposition he's placing here. And it really gripped me.
Have I ever said that there's not a single word or phrase wasted or carelessly put into that gospel?
That's wild. And then you gave us a quote, I think it was from Chrysostom, but you'll correct me in a second if I'm wrong, about loving the first place, and we need to be aware of loving first place.
Yes.
And
it was Chrysostom.
And so I guess I want to ask, like, if somebody's at home and they're listening to this and they want to do a bit of a report card, self-report card, like, okay, am I in love with the first place? Or am I okay with... Am I in love with the first instance of at his right or his left side, or am I embracing the path that is the second instance at the crucifixion of being on his left or his right? What are some signs that we're in love with the first place, I guess, is my question.
Well, I know one that shows up for me. If I feel like I've been exposed or I've been spoken badly of, my instinct is to be self-protective. It's instinct.
Yeah.
And they go, oh.
Like to be defensive and say, well, actually, you don't understand.
Yeah, and I didn't mean that, or I didn't do that.
Yeah.
Or how could they say that about me if it comes third hand, right? Which usually does in
Yeah.
the church. If I look at what my instinctive response, not the one that I know I should have, but
Yeah.
what's my instinctive, that's a pretty good sign. If I'm aware that things don't seem fair, that's not fair.
Yeah.
You know, I made that point collectively in the church. I'm so sad at the statistical reality that evangelical Christians are the least likely to give money from their own pocket to the homeless and have the most negative view of resident aliens, immigrants.
Yeah.
And that's not opinion, that's statistical reality.
Right.
Isn't that exactly broken, exactly opposite to what we talked about today?
Yeah. Yeah. There's one other question I'm going to quick ask. You, when you were talking about the parable, you talked about, like, hey, we shouldn't feel bad if we didn't come to Christ sooner. Like, I had lost years or whatever.
Yeah.
The thing that instantly jumped into my mind, and this isn't exactly on topic, but is just thinking about some of my friends who have for a very long time been longing for their spouse to come to Christ, to have revelation of of the saving grace of Jesus. And they have prayed and waited and, quietly, just patiently persevered. And to me, that's where I feel sad. Like, oh, man, they just have to keep waiting.
Yeah.
And it's a mystery. I don't understand.
Yeah, I don't either. It's back to the thing we talked about a couple weeks ago, that free will is in all of creation.
Yeah.
And there is pain and there is sadness.
Yeah.
I guess what I was talking about is where people can get kind of frustrated or sad about their own salvation. Man, I should have done this years ago.
For sure.
And there is at just the right time, that Galatians 4:4.
Yeah.
But I think what you're saying is very legitimate. Very legitimate. You know, the gospel, Christianity, no, let's call it the gospel, does not eliminate sorrow. Yeah. He's a man of sorrows. Yeah. And we try to, I think, Christianity, which tends to be almost the system we've created for the gospel. I'm not saying it's bad, but we tend to try to find ways to eliminate pain and sorrow and failure. Yeah. And they are part of life.
Yeah. Well, on that uplifting note.
Hey, hallelujah. But it is uplifting because he takes everything. He doesn't just take the good stuff.
Yeah.
He takes everything.
Yeah.
And, I've been reading this last month. I mentioned it a week or two ago, again, Julian of Norwich. And just this morning reading that our failure, she goes so far as saying she thinks it's a point of celebration in heaven because it's the only way we can understand the incredible beauty of his rescue and restoration.
Wow. Well, we'll wrap it up here. Thank you so much. Next week, we're on to chapter 21. We're on the home stretch, as Matthew pointed out. Jesus is on his way into Jerusalem. At some point, we'll come back to that question of how did these guys not see this coming? He said it so many times. It was the third time today that he's told them what's coming. But I'm looking forward to next week. Thanks so much for being with us. If you have questions, feel free to send them off to podcast@impactnations.com. We'd love to engage with those. And please do stay tuned for this announcement of the registration being opened. It is imminent. It's coming. Register early. Get your space saved here in Albuquerque. We'd love to have you. We're really excited for all of us to be together, and really excited to see Brad and Cherith and Brian right here in person. We do this every Thursday, and so we'd love to have you tune in live on Facebook or on YouTube, or you can catch it after the fact. If you head to impactnations.com/podcast, you can hit subscribe on your favorite podcast supplier there, and it'll just get delivered. The audio will be delivered right to your device, so you can listen to that on the way to work or whatever. Thanks again for joining us. Have a great week.
Bye-bye.